Okay, so this is the third video lecture in the chapter on theory. This is the chapter of theory and human growth and development. In this video lecture, I want to talk about learning perspective and maybe cognitive. So learning perspective is pretty straightforward. The observation or the issues of interest to learning perspective researchers or folks that use that lens, that theoretical lens, are things that can be observed. So whereas you had the psychoanalytical guys, they were really about what's below our awareness, the learning perspective people are interested in behaviors, right? There's no regard for things that are going on below your awareness. The classic, or the probably the most familiar, the one that we see more often in pop culture, is the idea of classical conditioning. This is what we do with our dogs, when we train our animals, is what we're trying to teach. What we're trying to model is how if you do this, this will be the result, right? That's what we talk about, how if you hear this clicker sound, that will cause the dog to act in a certain way because the dog will have learned that this clicker sound is associated with treats, right? The repeated response. So the classic experiment and I think there's a quiz question about, actually refers to this image over here and this little boy named Albert. The story goes, and the famous researcher is a fellow by the name of Watson. And the story goes that Watson wanted to demonstrate that you could influence emotional response to something or behavioral response. So Albert is, I don't know, a few months old. He's a baby of one of his research assistants, and he would put Albert on the rug, and he would hand Albert a white, fluffy animal of some sort. In some images, it's a rat. In others, it's a bunny rabbit. Whatever. And Albert, there's a bunny rabbit in that one. And Albert wasn't afraid of this fluffy rabbit. Well, that was the precondition. Then what Watson did is he would hand Albert this fluffy thing, and he would make a very loud noise in the background that would cause this child to startle, that would cause the kid to be scared. And he did this over and over and over again. And eventually what the child developed was a fear of the white fluffy thing, because the white fluffy thing had become associated with something scary. Much the same way that the clicker becomes associated for your dog with something good, the treat. For Albert, the white fluffy thing had become associated with something very scared. So he had conditioned Albert to be afraid of the white fluffy thing. I have read accounts that argue that for the rest of Albert's life, he was afraid of white fluffy things, like so much so that he was afraid of Santas or men with big beards, because he had so successfully conditioned Albert to be afraid. Now, the story of Albert, and this is an important point. Sometime I think it does show up on a quiz or a midterm exam. This would be illegal today. This would be considered unethical. For one thing, Albert was a child and did not consent to be part of this experiment. And a second thing is it caused harm. It actually hurt Albert. Today we have ethical standards in research, and this would never be allowed because Albert could not give consent, and it caused harm. It also makes being creative in your research lab a little bit more challenging. So there's other ways of thinking about behavioralism. You have operant conditioning, which is really a fancy way of saying how somebody learns to operate on the environment. They learn that if I do something, right, I can cause something to happen. The example I have here is a child really quickly learns that if I smile, I will make my mom smile, right? Or if I do certain things, I can get you to act in a certain way. So sometimes when we talk about how our children are manipulating us, right, or what we're really talking about is operant conditioning. We could also spend some time talking about the differences between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement and punishments. You can take a whole class in the psychology of learning and get down into the sort of the nitty gritty here. But I will say that both of these terms, negative and positive reinforcement, they're often used incorrectly. So like a positive reinforcement is when you get something for your behavior, right? You're getting an addition, right? That's what we would call a positive reinforcement. I get an additional thing if I act a certain way. A negative reinforcement is actually when something goes away. It's not when something bad happens. That is actually, if something bad happens when you do something, technically that's a positive reinforcement, but it's also a punishment because you're trying to get that thing to stop. But again, I'm sort of kind of going down the weeds here. But the point that I'm trying to make is these often get used sort of incorrectly. Another theory that you might hear is called social learning theory. Sometimes it's also called social cognitive theory. So a couple key phrases here is social, meaning other people, and learning or cognitive. Remember, cognitive means thinking, and learning is a kind of thinking. So this theory says that there is a relationship between social forces or between behaviors of others, social others, and how I think. And the theory says is that, so we have something called reciprocal determination. And that's the idea that my behavior, what does it say? Individuals affect the environment, which affect the individuals. So this is the idea that these things are sort of connected. And I learn to understand, I learn to recognize that if I act in a certain way, something else in the environment changes, and that affects how I think. So the key for social learning theory is that I think differently based on something in the environment. Another one is that I think differently. There's a couple chapters down the road, but it's the idea that I think differently about myself in response to something in the environment. But the key here about social learning is that the environment causes me to think a certain way. Observe, that's the key. The environment causes me to think a certain way. So here's another important term. You've got observational learning. And observational learning is when I learn how to act simply by watching somebody else or modeling behavior. Self-efficacy is a fancy term that falls under this umbrella. But what self-efficacy says is that efficacy sort of looks like effect. And the idea here is that I come to understand, to think, right? Hence the term cognitive. I come to think and to understand how if I act, that will cause something in the environment to change. So I think in psychology we talked about the role of people who have self-efficacy. They have a sense that they have some control over their world. What this theory says is that we learn that. We learn by watching our environment, right? Social, we learn, right? By watching our environment, how to think about ourselves and our place in ourselves. I think I may have made this more complicated than it needs to be, but I am actually going to stop here. So again, the gist of this theory is that I watch the environment and I think, and that affects how I think. I'm going to stop here.